Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Broback.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are returning to our dear friend, Mr. Satterthwaite, and his spooky friend, Mr.
Imaginary
Harlequin. Yeah, potentially imaginary friend, although I will note, perhaps for the first time in this story, other people do see Mr. Quin.
This is true. So before we get into our story for this episode, The Dead Harlequin, I just wanted to note about our Patreon account that we are indeed up and running, and we have been thrilled by the response that we've gotten from so many of you who have been so kind and generous as to sign up and join us over in the Patreon community. And those who have been able to enjoy our quite lively discussion about the ABC Murders adaptation starring John Malkovich. And we just wanted to flag that opportunity again for listeners over at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/allaboutagatha. If you are interested in that episode and then in future content, and we should let you know that our next episode is going to be a discussion of the BBC radio adaptation of our most beloved book thus far, Five Little Pigs.
Yay!
Catherine is so excited.
Anytime you bring up Five Little Pigs, Kemper, I just get overwhelmed with emotion. So I think that will be a good start to talking about the radio adaptations. And as much as I can tolerate listening to us, I loved the ABC Murders episode. I think it was a wide-ranging, interesting conversation. And I'm glad that other people are joining us on it.
Absolutely. I just wanted to say also, we appreciate the fact that you, our listeners, are being generous enough to contribute to this crazy podcasting endeavor that we're doing. And one of the direct reasons for why we chose to go the route of Patreon is that we have a number of operating costs actually associated with the podcast, not just the materials that we need to acquire, such as the many, many books and other secondary sources that we use for our discussions, but also the third-party hosting of our audio files in perpetuity for this podcast.
Our editing software.
Believe it or not, these files are edited for sound.
I know, despite those of you who think it sounds occasionally like we're recording in a bathroom, they
and it
are
does
edited.
Sometimes. Fair enough. Fair point.
Yeah. Right.
There are just a lot of incidental costs that, especially after 2.5 years of doing this, just begin to add up. So to make this a sustainable effort that we can continue on in terms of the free podcast that we're providing, and hopefully for years and years beyond that, because we certainly could continue to talk about Christie for the rest of our natural lives, and perhaps even our unnatural lives as ghosts.
Our Mr. Quinning of it all?
I'll talk about Christie beyond the grave. That's sort of what's behind this new endeavor, in addition to just also being excited about a different forum in which we can branch out from the standard kind of episodes that we do here and do something a little different on Patreon.
Be just a little looser,
Yeah, a little bit looser, if that doesn't scare you too much.
I know. I think there might have even been a single curse word in that episode.
There may have been. I may have not edited out for once.
I know.
Catherine's rampant cursing.
As my mother would say, aren't you more educated than that, Catherine? You do not need to be a sailor.
Patreon.com. That's patreon.com/allaboutagatha. In any case, back to our regularly scheduled programming, which is the mysterious Mr. Quin, and specifically the dead Harlequin. That is the story we're discussing this week. Catherine Brobeck, could you tell us a little bit about the publication history on this one?
I can indeed. It was first published in March 1929 in the Grand Magazine and in June 1929 in the U.S. in Detective Fiction Weekly. It obviously was then published as part of the Mysterious Mr. Quin collection in April of 1930.
I would also note that this story is noticeably longer than a lot.
It's much longer.
It's very long. I think we're on the same page about this, that it's quite delightful, actually. I was diverted from beginning to end, so the length was not an issue. It's just, when you're comparing it to the others in the collection, it's very obviously longer. And I think that speaks to the fact that Christie wrote these when she wanted to and how she wanted to, which she talks about in her autobiography, which is why the Mr. Quin stories had always been some of her favorites. I think you can feel that joy in this story,
I agree. And I think when we first started this endeavor, I think that we were a little hesitant maybe about the Mr. Quin stories, but I always look forward to them.
Me too. We still have a number of them, too. I mean, the Mysterious Mr. Quin collection is a more robust collection than I also remembered. And I believe there are even one or two Mr. Quin stories beyond this collection. So we still have a fair amount of Mr. Quin in our future, which makes me happy.
Me All right. Too. So who's our victim, Kemper?
Yeah, so our victim in The Dead Harlequin is Lord Charnley, who had killed himself some 15 years earlier than the events of this story in his country house, Charnley. Shall we discuss the suspects?
First of all, is Lord Charnley, since he was in a locked room at Charnley with a gun in his hand and in an apparent suicide. So he would be the obvious suspect in his own demise. But since this is a murder mystery, there are a few other people on hand at the scene of this crime, as told a little bit in retrospect.
Yeah, we have another crime told in retrospect, a la Five Little Pigs and The Coming of Mr. Quin, the very first Mr. Quin story. And this whole notion of retelling long past events and gaining a fresh, penetrating perspective on them has been visited time and time again in the Mr. Quin collection. So this is, I think, the Mr. Quiniest story.
In Mr. Quin, yes.
In Mr. Quin, thus far, anyway. We're firing on all Quin cylinders here. All right, next up in our suspects, we have Alex Charnley, a.k.a. Lady Charnley. That is Lord Charnley's pregnant wife, pregnant at the time of this would-be suicide, who used to be, quote, one of the prettiest girls you could see anywhere, and then after the death of her husband turned into a ghost herself, perhaps because she felt guilty about it. We shall see.
And then we have Hugo Charnley, Lord Charnley's brother. And if Lord Charnley were to suddenly expire, he would be the heir, unless, of course, that baby that Alex is pregnant with were to be a boy.
Intriguing. Next up, we have Colonel Monckton, who is the person who is reminiscing about this murder in the present. And spoiler, he's never really a suspect. He didn't do it. So we're going to kick him out of this list. But it's helpful to mention him because he was there. And he's not the sole narrator of these events, but he is the primary narrator.
And then we have the weeping lady with the silver ewer. And that is exactly what it sounds like, a ghost. And apparently there's also a headless ghost of Charles I. Of
course there is.
Haunting Charnley, because why not? We've seen ghosts from time to time in Christie before. Shout out Mystery of the Blue Train. Let us never forget. Yeah. So you don't know. And then this ghost specifically is known to turn up after people in the Charnley family die.
Sounds suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
And then rounding out our list of suspects, we have various other guests attending this fancy dress party where the incident happens at Charnley, some of whom are merely incidental and others who may turn out to be more important. We shall find out more about that as we get into the world as it appears to be. Take it away, Catherine Brobeck.
Mr. Satterthwaite, our good friend, is at an art show, as he's wont to do, for a rising new artist named Frank Bristow. I think Mr. Satterthwaite and I have some things in common. He is very invested in all of the paintings, but particularly a striking one that is called, wait for it, The Dead Harlequin. And it unsurprisingly involves a dead harlequin on a rug on a checker-tiled floor and another, perhaps the same figure looking in through the window. But more surprising to Mr. Satterthwaite is that figure appears to be none other than Harlequin.
And I have to pull out from the story when this happens, because when he sees the painting, he drew in his breath with a gasp. And then Christie talks about how excited he got about this. It just seems to really be, he has a visceral reaction to this painting. But I love how Christie oh so casually references the Quin-Satterthwaite friendship. It bore a distinct resemblance to a certain Mr. Quin, an acquaintance whom Mr. Satterthwaite had encountered once or twice under somewhat mystifying circumstances. A, once or twice, it's been a lot more than that. And B, somewhat mystifying. The man jumped over a cliff.
He literally walked off over the sea into the sunset. Yeah. I mean, and also, I want to point out that Mr. Satterthwaite occasionally just shows up at the restaurant Harlequin in the hopes of running into him. So, yeah, he has not met him once or twice.
I'm not sure if we're going to mention it when we get to the dinner party because there's so much else going on, but there's a dinner party that happens within the story, and there's an empty plate set out for Harlequin, just in case he happens to show up. It makes me think that Mr. Satterthwaite might always set out an empty plate for Harlequin at his dinner table.
Yeah, it also really goes to the idea that perhaps this is Fight Club.
I ask you for one thing. One simple thing.
Why do people think that I'm you?
Yeah. Anyway, the house in the picture, or the room in the picture, looks very specific. It looks like a specific room called the Terrace Room in a specific house, Charnley, where Mr. Satterthwaite once knew the owner. That would be Lord Charnley. And so he immediately buys the painting, and then he gets the gallerist to invite the painter over Chez Satterthwaite.
Mr. Satterthwaite also invites Colonel Monckton over for dinner, who was a friend of Lord Charnley before he, killed himself in the Oak Room at the very haunted Charnley estate during a fancy dress party. And obviously Mr. Satterthwaite he's intrigued by all this from the painting, which is why he invites over Colonel Monckton. And before we get into the meat of the story, we should note that Frank Bristow, the artist, is kind of a pill. He is a young man with a major chip on his shoulder when it comes to elites, such as Satterthwaite and Monckton. There's this whole amusing bit where they're talking about visiting Charnley, and Colonel Monckton asks him, do you know the family? Like, how did you become acquainted with the house to be able to paint it? And Frank Bristow says, I went there in a charabanc. I actually did not know what a charabanc was. Did you?
No.
So a charabanc is a sort of like bus contraption, a little similar actually to the Pullman coach from the last Parker Pine story that we covered. And it comes from the French char à banc, which is carriage with wooden benches. And it's basically this pleasure vehicle that tourists would tend to use because it accommodates large parties when they visited houses. It was a way of sort of announcing his low class status by saying, well, I visited there. It's kind of like
tourist, not because he was invited. But not
I wasn't invited.
Satterthwaite and Monckton, yeah.
But I'm one of the hoi polloi, and they're kind of aghast. And Mr. Satterthwaite is more just realizing, like, oh, God, this dinner party is not going to go so well if this young man continues to have such a chip on his shoulder. And he does manage to get Frank Bristow to show a little bit of a softer side when Frank recounts a chance run-in with an ethereal woman on a train prior to any of the events happening in this story. And he became enamored with this woman. They talked on the train for hours, but in his sort of grumpy, curmudgeonly way, he supposes he'll never meet her again. And it's very odd and tangential when Frank Bristow talks about that early on in the story. And yeah, I think that may somehow become important later on. We shall see.
You think? We'll find out. Satterthwaite gets Monckton to reminisce about what happened the night Lord Charnley killed himself. And we've seen this before in the Mr. Quin stories, as well as, my beloved Five Little Pigs. So apparently on the night of this fancy dress party, one of the female guests, called out to Lord Charnley as he wandered into the oak parlor and shut the door. And I would note here the oak parlor, that's sort of the haunted Charles the first ghost room.
Right.
It was rumored to have a priest hole in it too, and it had this shady history filled with duels and drama. There's a mysterious floor stain that never comes out. It even has bullet holes in the wall. So the people at the party hear this gunshot after Charlie hides out in the oak parlor. So they end up eventually breaking down the door to the room where they find Charlie's body. Later on, Alex Charlie finds a letter from a governess named Monica Ford, who Lord Charlie apparently, quote unquote, made love to, and who was supposedly also pregnant. And so she had said that she was going to tell Alex, Lord Charlie's wife, and Alex assumes that this is why he killed himself. We also learn that Monica Ford was one of the guests at the fancy dress party the night of the incident, interestingly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Alex even went to Monica afterwards, and she confirmed all that was true.
Right. And just to reiterate, the painting, which has this dead Harlequin figure, is not of the oak parlor in
No,
Charlie.
it's of the terrace room.
It's of the terrace room. So the terrace room is the sort of, more open, lighter, brighter, almost kind of reception room where this party was mainly taking place. And obviously one would withdraw into the oak parlor. It's actually not confusing when you're reading the story, but the story is a little hard. It's harder to talk about than it is to read. Let's just put it that way.
It's very readable because it manages to spell it out in a very clear way that's not easy to talk about.
It's not easy to summarize. And the story takes its time. I mean, that's part of why I think it's so long, that this is all, very leisurely kind of explained and explored, and it's entertaining, but it takes its time. So in the middle of this long tale being told after dinner, Mr. Satterthwaite is then visited by an actress.
Why not?
Why not? Aspasia Glenn. She very much made me think of Carlotta Adams. Shout out to Lord Edgeworth Dies, because she is a talented mimic. She can kind of put on different impersonations that, both mimic real people, and she can create her own characters. And Aspasia Glenn is determined to buy the painting that Mr. Satterthwaite just bought, the dead Harlequin. He's a bit turned off by her. He's really not interested in giving her the painting. But then, lo and behold, another person calls the house at the same time. This is turning out to be a very busy night, and it'll get even busier. And this person also indicates an interest in buying the painting, and she is Alex Charlie herself, Lady Charlie. This is, of course, the woman who was pregnant with Lord Charlie's child the night that he seems to have killed himself. And Mr. Satterthwaite is totally cool with giving her the painting, but he requests that she come on over that very night, and she complies, because the more the merrier, and apparently Mr. Satterthwaite sort of has something up his sleeve, or at least is just intrigued by all of the interest and the attractions that this painting seems to be holding over so many people, so he wants it all to play out within one stage, so to speak.
In all honesty, if I happened to walk into an art gallery and I saw a painting of someplace I recognized, and then I thought I saw somebody I knew in the painting, I would probably be very intrigued by anybody who had interest in it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense that he's bringing all of these people together.
And boy, are there a lot of them, because now we have Frank, we have the Colonel, we have Aspasia, we have Alex, we have Satterthwaite, and who else but Mr. Harlequin, who decides to drop in. Alex,
it ain't a true party till Mr. Harlequin, materializes in
the room. Yeah. So Alex in particular has a really weird interaction with Aspasia, who she seems to know, which makes sense because Aspasia is famous. But that's not why Alex thinks she knows her.
It's an odd kind of introduction between the two of them, and she can't place exactly how she knows her, but there's clearly more there, and we will certainly find out what is at the bottom of that. And now it is time for some clues to abridge ourselves from the very confusing yet intriguing world as it appears to be and the world as it actually is. So clue number one has to do with a rug. And to a certain extent, this whole conversation starts off because Mr. Satterthwaite notes the one difference between the terrace room at Charnley as it really is and as it was depicted in Frank Bristow's painting, other than the dead Harlequin lying on the floor. And that difference is this wonderful rug that Frank left out of his painting. Mr. Satterthwaite at his house actually shows a photo of the real thing out of a book that he has published himself called Homes of My Friends. This is very much just casually dropped in there. But Mr. Satterthwaite,
I love this. It's my favorite thing in this story.
He published a book called Homes of My Friends with pictures of all of his fancy friends in it.
I love this.
That seems a little tacky for one as sophisticated as Mr. Satterthwaite. I don't know. I was a little disappointed.
I don't know. I think there are like lots of very glamorous, famous people who have done like Vogue spreads that are like, here's my vacation in Tangiers. It's a common feature in magazines like Vogue.
Right. You know what it is too? I think that in the 21st century, in the age of Instagram and personal branding and self-promotion and all of that, that's so commonplace that I think looking at something like this in hindsight, in the context of all of that nonsense, makes it seem trashier than it probably was, or than it at least had to be.
Because I just 100% picture this as like a Town and Country or Vogue feature about like, oh, and here I am staying in, Deauville at this place, and, we're going to have a glossy spread on it.
The other thing I would just note is that I think it makes a little more sense if the person publishing a book like that or having a magazine spread to that effect is an artist or an actor or someone who has a skill set that makes them an inherently interesting person. But Mr. Satterthwaite is just rich. Right?
Well, right. And he's not. And here's the thing. If we knew that Mr. Satterthwaite were a photographer, I think it would be different. It's, you have somebody like Princess Margaret's husband, like Anthony Armstrong Jones, who's like obviously a famous photographer who also had access to all of these very famous people. So you could publish a photography book if that is who you're running with, you can do it. But we don't know that Mr. Satterthwaite is a photographer. So it's like unclear what's actually in this book.
But you know what? I'm sure the book is very tastefully done.
Oh my gosh, impeccable, probably. He clearly has very good taste. That's what it's the joke at the beginning with the gallerist is that he gets essentially a private pre-sale. That's how he gets the painting because he is such an art lover and such a good patron of the arts that he gets to go to the pre-sale. I
mean, I have to say, within the world of meta fiction that exists only inside the Christieverse, and we have all of Ariadne Oliver's novels, this, more than anything, is the book that I wish existed, that I would love to read, Homes of My Friends.
I would well, Mr. Satterthwaite, think of all the duchesses that he's friends with.
And his little captions on it, exquisite.
Because you know that he would be so slightly, it would be like a little bit backhanded at all times. Yep. Oh, it'd be great. Let's be honest, Graydon Carter probably has published a book called Homes of My Friends.
or should. He hasn't.
Or should, yes.
So that is the book that Mr. Satterthwaite shoves in Frank Bristow's face. And Frank Bristow notes that, yes, the rug was there when he looked at it, but to his artist's eye, it seemed out of place. And that's why he left it out of the painting. He didn't think it went with the black and white tile scheme in the terrace room. And Colonel Monckton confirms that, this rug actually used to be in the oak parlor, so it did not belong there. And the deduction here is that, well, obviously the rug was moved for some reason into the terrace room, and it had to be around the time of this incident, since Colonel Monckton can confirm that when all this was happening, the rug, at least earlier in his stay, was in the oak parlor. So one of the more obvious reasons, given the crime here of a gunshot, could be that perhaps it was covering bloodstains. It's not a huge leap for a reader, an astute reader, to make. That would mean the murder actually happened in the terrace room, not the oak room. And we have Frank Bristow's unerring artistic instinct here for sussing out death and mayhem in the terrace room as well. Like, there has to be sort of a reason why he chose that room above any others, and especially the oak room, for his Dead Harlequin painting. He clearly could pick up some bad juju here. There really is some lip
Right.
service paid to that notion in the story. And, let's never forget Christie's belief in what good artists are capable of from, again, Five Little Pigs. And we should also note that supporting this hypothesis/deduction is part of the discussion in the story about some weird business with the body being in an odd location within the oak room and how there was minimal blood splatter there. Also, Lord Charnley was shot through the heart, and Frank Bristow himself notes that that is a hard place to shoot oneself, the head being the more obvious spot. So all this information is backing up the notion that perhaps the killing actually took place in the terrace room and was not a suicide, but was in fact murder.
So clue number 2, the gunshot holes and the priest hole. Christie manages to lay in this information pretty seamlessly, especially for a short story. But we're told outright that this quote-unquote locked room has a hiding place in it.
And I feel like priest holes come up in Christie often. I'm pretty sure there was one in, dare I speak its name, The Secret of Chimneys.
There absolutely was, and that was exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, and then they call.
Well, no, it's a secret passage in.
Yeah,
The Secret of Chimneys.
I don't. Oh, right. In The Secret of Chimneys, yes, there's definitely a secret passage. But I mean, the priest hole can literally just be a recess that a person can hide in, and the derivation is, of course, the notion that when Catholicism was essentially outlawed in the UK, this was a place where a priest could hide if a Catholic-leaning home was being raided.
But what we have to realize as a result of that is someone could easily have been hiding in it the whole time, but it exists. And also the room already has all these gunshot holes in it because it has this torrid history. So what better place would there be to fake a gunshot to the head, since no one would possibly notice yet another gunshot hole in the walls?
Which is pretty clever, actually.
It's very clever, right. So the deduction is that the suicide by gunshot heard in the oak room might not have happened. Lord Charnley, especially with the lack of blood, he could easily have already been dead, which means that the man who went into the oak room as Lord Charnley was not, in fact, Lord Charnley. And, in fact, the only reason he was so identified was because that pesky guest called out his name, identifying him as Lord Charnley. And who was that guest? It was Monica Ford.
Mm-hmm. All right, clue number 3, and I'm so glad that I am able to share this.
I know, you're going to just be so delighted
listeners.
for this one.
Prepare yourselves, actors.
Intruder alert! Intruder alert!
We have an actor in this
Actors.
story, and we even have elements of costuming thrown in here for good measure. Remember, this is a fancy dress party, so we've got wigs and robes and just all sorts of ways to hide one's appearance. So what is the deduction here? The actor did it.
Yeah, it's like, just go for that. If you don't have any other clues in a Christie story and there's an actor in it, just assume the actor did it.
I
Yeah.
mean, obviously, to be fair, that is not always the case. There are plenty of actors in Christie who didn't do it, such as Carlotta Adams. However, you know what? Carlotta Adams was killed. She was dispatched way before the end of the novel, so we knew for sure that she didn't do it. We have a live actor here at the end of the story, Aspasia Glenn, so she's almost definitely going to be guilty, and we don't know how. We don't know if she had an accomplice, how exactly she did it, but the actor was involved, and I would call that All About Agatha 101.
Totally agreed.
All right, Catherine, let's talk about the world as it actually is, because we're close. We're almost there.
So altogether, this group figures out that the entire thing could have happened like this. Someone shoots Lord Charnley in the terrace room. Then his body is dragged into the oak parlor where it is concealed for a little while. The rug from the oak room is placed over the blood splatter in the terrace room. So none of the guests see it. They're basically walking on top of new blood. And then some other man, remember, everybody here is at a fancy dress party, so there are wigs and costumes, etc. Another man is headed towards the oak parlor, and Monica Ford calls out Lord Charnley, so everyone assumes it's him. This man goes in, he fires off a gunshot that no one will notice, and then he hides himself in the priest hole, and voila, we have a closed room suicide.
The only catch is, how could anyone clean up those bloodstains afterward in the terrace room under the rug? Well, let's go back to our superstition surrounding the weeping lady with the silver ewer. She apparently appears after any death within the Charnley family, and there are people who claim to have seen her that very night that this happened. which of course makes sense from a superstitious standpoint, but
right.
we should never believe superstition in Christie. Almost
Unless
never.
it's a mystery, the blue train.
Unless it's a mystery blue train. So what if this was a real woman, an actress, say, dressed as the Weeping Lady, and her silver ewer was an actual jug of water used to clean up some blood?
And then, very conveniently, Alex finally puts two and two together and realizes that the actress Aspasia Glenn is in fact Monica Ford, the tearful governess. Yeah, she even visited after the fact, but keep in mind this was 15 years ago, who claimed to be having an affair with her husband, but she was just acting because the person she was really having a dalliance with was Lord Charnley's younger brother, Hugo.
What?
Because, yeah, they thought that once Lord Charnley died, the estate and the title would go to Hugo, but of course the joke was on them because they were unaware that Alex was pregnant and she turned out to have a boy. Whoops.
Dickie.
Yeah, Dickie. He really wins out because he is Lord Charnley now.
Yeah, Dickie is Lord Charnley. So we learned that Hugo chucked Aspasia / Monica after this happened and that he died a year ago. We also learned that Aspasia / Monica was always convinced that someone had been watching them when they did what they did. And she is now convinced that someone was none other than Harlequin, because of course he is the face who is looking into the terrace room in the painting, and she is now face to face with him in this room. And here's the thing. Harlequin doesn't deny it.
No.
He's like, well, yeah, of course I was there because I'm everywhere because I'm a ghost. So she asks him, Aspasia / Monica, why did you break your silence now? That is what I want to know. And he responds, perhaps so that the dead may rest in peace, which is a very Mr. Quin thing to say.
Super on brand. And then Aspasia / Monica totally pulls a runner. But it's all good because Alex Charnley comes alive again. She says, it is so wonderful to be alive again after being so long dead. Very on point. And then Mr. Satterthwaite gives Frank Bristow, our artist, some tough love that is worth reading out loud.
Please let me do the honors.
Go ahead.
All right. This is what he says to Frank Bristow at the end. You would do well to disabuse your mind of some very old-fashioned notions, one of which is that birth has any significance at all in our modern conditions. You are one of those large-proportioned young men whom women always consider good-looking, and you have possibly, if not certainly, genius. Just say that to yourself 10 times before you go to bed every night, and in 3 months' time, go and call on Lady Charnley at Charnley. Because, dear listeners, Alex Charnley is, of course, the ethereal woman on the train who Frank Bristow had met that night. And there is a throwaway reference to it when the two of them meet at Mr. Satterthwaite's house. But it's not really completely brought home until the very end of the story. And, you know, if Frank Bristow takes Mr. Satterthwaite's advice, which it seems that he's going to because he breaks through his curmudgeonliness here, they're totally going to live happily ever after. I think that the reason Mr. Quin interceded now was most specifically because of this little love connection.
Yeah, to have the happy ending.
They're the love detectives, right? Harlequin and Mr. Satterthwaite. Yeah. And I also, just as a final little button, I mean, I really appreciated the fact that apparently Mr. Satterthwaite is into his daily affirmations.
I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
Well, that is The Dead Harlequin. Join us next episode for something pretty special because we are doing, at long last, another Miss Marple short story. We haven't done a Miss Marple short story in so long.
Not in a long time.
Not in a long time because we've had a couple of Miss Marple novels, but we actually have a mini dry spell here before our next Miss Marple novel, which is not until a murder is announced. So we have at least 4 or 5 titles until then. So we figured it was high time to do a Miss Marple short story to tide us over, and we will be discussing Miss Marple Tells a Story.
Interesting.
Yeah. In the meantime, we would love to hear from you as we always do. First off, we will share our Patreon URL with you once again. That is www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. please do join us there. We would love to grow that community just as we continue to grow this podcasting community. And we would love to hear from you in our various social media forums and also via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. Find Catherine at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. Our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And we still very much appreciate and desire ratings and reviews wherever you're listening to this podcast in the continuing effort to help others find the podcast. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.